I was wondering if I could work here for a little while. I don't mind if my wages are just bread crusts. Without thinking, I blurted out. It's not every day a customer talks to me out of the blue, especially on their first visit. But asking to work for bread crusts, that's a first. The old woman looked very frail. Even through her worn, dirty clothes, it was clear she was skin and bones. Bread crusts. Really? I'm sorry, but I looked straight into her eyes, which held a very serious expression, and began explaining the situation. I told her about the current financial state of the shop, and how there was a looming plan to build a high-rise apartment nearby, which might force us to close the shop entirely. She looked a little sad, but soon she smiled kindly. It's important that small shops like this stay open. I hope you can keep it going as long as possible. She gave me those encouraging words, then bowed deeply, clutching the croissant she had just bought. It was only then that I noticed the strange aura about the old woman. Her eyes held something deeper, some unspoken emotion that seemed to linger. Well, the shop's closing soon, but if you'd like, would you like to come in for a cup of coffee? She looked surprised for a moment, but then her warm smile returned as she nodded. I flipped the sign on the door to closed and led her to the back room. I made some coffee and reheated the croissant she had bought earlier. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the room, and she closed her eyes for a second, inhaling deeply. Such a lovely smell. It warms the heart, she said with a smile. My name is Rosie. Rosie took a slow, deliberate bite of the croissant. She wasn't eating because she was hungry. It was as if she was savoring every bite, studying the taste carefully. It made me feel a bit awkward, so I looked away. Even after finishing the last bite, she didn't comment on the croissant. She took a sip of coffee, letting out a quiet sigh. I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said earlier. So what did you mean when you said you didn't mind getting paid with bread crusts? Rosie looked down, her expression thoughtful, and after a pause, she began to speak slowly. My name is Tiana. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and steadied my breath, which had gotten a bit uneven. The bakery stood quietly on the outskirts of a residential area, tucked away from the main streets. The old sign above the door, with faded letters that read Le Plantain, hinted at how long the shop had been there. The wooden door and window frames were weathered, with patches peeling away from years of exposure to the elements. In the back of the shop, I was covered in flour, kneading the dough and spreading it out with my hands. At first, the dough felt tough, sticking to my palms, but as I worked it, I could feel it softening with the warmth of my hands. The faint smell of yeast, mixed with the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread, filled the dimly lit shop. When I closed my eyes, memories from my childhood would surface. When was it again? The memory of making bread with my mom, Cyndy, who's no longer with me. Tiana, making bread is all about love. Her gentle voice echoed in my mind, like an old black and white movie. She would hold my tiny hands and guide me through the process of kneading the dough. She taught me how to gently press the dough, folding it over and over to let the air in. Like this. See, you need to let the air in. That's how you get soft, fluffy bread. Why does bread need love? At that time, I tilted my head in confusion. Cyndy, with a smile yet serious expression, said to me, love-filled bread can make people happy. Don't you notice how everyone who buys our bread looks so cheerful when they leave? Looking back now, I feel a little envious of her words from that day. The memories glow faintly, continuing to live in my heart. My dad, Arnold, and Mom had been battling illness for several years. It's been 2 years since they both passed away, almost at the same time. There was no way I could let go of the bakery they built. I chose to carry on my parents' legacy and keep the shop running. Originally, I worked an office job in a small town, but I quit to move back home and take care of my parents. Arnold hated hospitals, and his condition worsened so quickly that he passed away soon after. After his death, Mom became so worn down that watching her was painful for me. Before she passed, she would often reminisce, saying, "Those were the happy days back then." She cried many times while remembering the past. It was hard for me to see her, who I always thought was strong and kind, breaking down in front of me, but I forced myself to keep smiling around her. Those were the happy days. I wondered which time in her life she was seeing in those distant eyes of hers. "This is delicious. The bread you made is so good, Tiana." As a child, I would wake up early on weekends to knead bread with her, just to see the joy on Mom's face. That routine of waking up early continued throughout elementary, middle, and high school. I didn't mind helping out at the shop, because it was my way of spending time with my parents, who were always working. But now, being alone, the morning preparations are exhausting for me. I ask myself why I decided to reopen the bakery in the first place. When my parents first fell ill, the shop closed for a time. A few years after they passed away, I did a simple renovation and reopened the bakery. The longtime regular customers were thrilled, but the bread I bake is just the same old-fashioned kind my parents taught me to make. Though I graduated from culinary school and have a license, I knew how hard running a business was, so I chose to work at a regular company, leaving a gap in my bakery experience. Recently, more stylish bakeries have been opening near the station. I've visited them several times to check out the competition, and they're trendy, with bright, modern interiors designed for younger customers. The bread is trendy too, crafted to be Instagram-worthy. In terms of appeal, I couldn't compete. On top of competing for customers, rising ingredient costs were making it hard to keep the bakery afloat. I have to work harder, and even harder. I muttered to myself, kneading the dough. I noticed the unnecessary tension in my hands and bit my lip. With my parents' teachings in mind, I was determined to bake bread with love every day. But love alone wasn't enough. I didn't have any formal training in bread making, so my knowledge was quite limited. In fact, even though the dough is supposed to be kneaded by a mixer, I still struggled with using it and had to knead everything by hand. Every morning, I would check the dough I had prepared the day before, shape it, and bake it. Compared to the days when my parents worked together, my skills were far less refined, and our productivity had dropped significantly. I would use the leftover bread from the previous day to make things like rusks, but even I felt embarrassed by how inefficient I was. Around 8 a.m., as the bread came out of the oven, I started arranging it on display. Even the way I displayed the bread didn't seem to have any sense of style. I couldn't help but feel that my shop looked plain compared to others in the area. Every day, I wrestled with how to set up the display. Then the doorbell chimed. "The sign doesn't even say we're open yet," I thought, as I turned around. It was Nicola, my childhood friend. She was a little taller than me, looking down at me with that cold gaze of hers. Nicola, the daughter of the local landowner, had always been someone everyone respected or feared, ever since our school days. When we were younger, she used to come to the store with her kind dad, always holding his hand, buying bread together. But now, Nicola, who I hadn't seen in a long time, glanced at the bread in the shop, while crossing her arms and smiling at me. I paused my display work, feeling frozen in place. She had always been so unpredictable, and honestly, I was never comfortable around her. She wore a sleek, expensive suit that didn't quite fit the humble atmosphere of my shop, with a famous designer handbag slung over her shoulder. "Long time no see, Tiana," she said with a cold smile. There was something unsettling behind that smile, as if she had some hidden agenda. I tried to stay cautious, wondering what she could want. But before I could say anything, Nicola spoke up. "Actually, my dad is planning to turn this whole area into luxury condos. Of course, your shop is included in the plan." "Luxury condos? In this residential neighborhood?" "Yes. The houses around here are old, and the residents are elderly. Many of them are looking to sell their land, so we thought it would be better to tear everything down and redevelop the area." As she spoke, Nicola picked up one of the wrapped sandwiches nearby. She examined it for a moment, then put it back, as if deep in thought. "Tiana, to be honest, I don't think your store can survive much longer. Not with prices and quality like this." Her words were filled with blatant disdain. "Why would you say something like that?" "Because, who really cares about your bread? My dad's condo project is far more exciting. It's going to attract all the wealthy people to this area." Nicola laughed, a sound that sent a shiver through me. I wanted to respond. But why? Why did the bread I put so much love into suddenly feel so worthless? As I stood there, quietly stewing in my frustration, Nicola slowly walked closer, clearly enjoying the effect her words were having on me. She cast a cold glance at the unarranged bread I had on the counter, then laughed under her breath. "Who would want to eat bread kneaded by such dirty hands? Maybe only poor people buy from you." I bit my lip and stayed silent, my rough hands trembling slightly. Seeing this, she continued speaking, her tone almost playful. "But don't worry. If my dad develops this area, your store might survive as part of one of the high-rise apartments. I shouldn't argue now. If I say anything, she will just enjoy mocking me even more." Nicola pulled a thin envelope of documents out of her bag and threw it at me. The papers hit my back and fell to the floor. Nicola placed one foot on the documents, bending her knee as she lowered herself. "These are the papers to sell the land, so sign them quickly. Otherwise, your store will end up looking like an abandoned island with nothing around it." She blew a breath at my bangs, gave a small laugh, then stood up and walked out of the store. I watched her leave and let out a deep sigh. With frustration and anger bubbling up from the depths of my soul, I continued preparing to open the shop. "I'm going to protect this store, no matter what." I clenched my fists tightly, making sure no one could see. But from that point on, sales at the store slowly started to decline. I didn't hear it directly, but it seemed like someone was spreading bad rumors about us. A small bakery has its own charm because it's small. At our store, we pride ourselves on using local ingredients and hand-kneading everything. However, someone spread a rumor that we were using foreign flour and that the bread was factory-made, not handmade. It wasn't true, but the number of customers kept dwindling while the leftover bread on the shelves piled up more and more. As the sun began to set, silence fell outside the shop. No matter how few customers came, I decided to keep making bread with all my heart. Surely, someday, people would understand. Someday. But when? I muttered to myself, staring at the unsold savory bread, trying desperately to hold back the tears rising up. Just then, the bell on the door softly rang. An elderly woman entered the store, silhouetted by the setting sun. Her body was frail, even through her clothes. I could tell she had lost weight. Her sunken eyes looked lifeless, as if she might collapse at any moment. She was holding a large suitcase, the kind you'd take on an overseas trip. Out of curiosity, I glanced at the handle, where a keychain, the type you'd find at a souvenir shop, hung with the name Rosie written on it. That must be her name, I thought, a small smile tugging at my lips, which I quickly hid. Welcome. Please take your time browsing. Rosie nodded slightly at me, her eyes studying my face for a moment. Then, she looked down, as if deep in thought, before slowly glancing around the shop. Eventually, her gaze settled on the croissants, her eyes narrowing slightly. Could I have one of these? Her voice was weak. I nodded, picked up a croissant, and headed to the register. After completing the transaction, Rosie turned back to me, looking a little nervous. The store's name is Printemps, right? Huh? Oh, yes. My parents named it. I'm not quite sure what it means. I tried to laugh it off, but Rosie gave a small, complex smile. She stared lovingly at the croissant wrapped in the plastic bag, and I found myself watching her with a strange sense of curiosity. Was the croissant something special to her? Finally, Rosie seemed to gather her courage and spoke. Actually, I was wondering if I could work here for a bit. You can pay me in bread crusts. Without thinking, what? I blurted out. It's rare for a customer, especially one I've just met today, to approach me like this. But it's even rarer for them to ask to work here. For bread crusts, no less. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. But Rosie's face was dead serious. There was no trace of a joke in her eyes. So I decided to take her seriously. I took off my work hat and faced her with sincerity. I'm sorry, but I looked straight into Rosie's eyes, which were filled with determination, and began to explain the situation. I explained the state of the business, how the foot traffic had slowed down, and how a high-rise development might eventually force us to close the bakery for good. As I spoke, I found myself wondering why I was telling all this to a stranger I had just met. But there was something about Rosie's earnest demeanor that made me want to open up to her. The number of customers has dropped so much that right now, I'm managing the shop by myself. Rosie's expression softened, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. It's so important for small shops like this to stay open. I really hope you can keep going. She offered me words of encouragement, a croissant in her hand, before bowing slightly in gratitude. Watching her bow, my chest tightened, even amid the negative rumors. It felt so meaningful that there were still people who appreciated the bread I put so much love into making. Her words were a comfort, and for a moment, the weight of my worries lifted just a little. Thank you. I'll do my best to keep this place going, I responded with a determined smile. Rosie nodded, her expression turning slightly wistful as she gazed at me. It was then that I finally noticed the deep emotions hidden in her eyes. There was something more behind her words, something heavy and unresolved. Despite my inner hesitation, I couldn't help but ask, "The shop is about to close for the day, but if you'd like, how about a cup of coffee inside?" Rosie looked a bit surprised at my offer, but then her warm smile returned, and she nodded. "I'd love that." I flipped the open sign on the door to closed and led Rosie to the back room. The old furniture was worn and dusty, but each piece carried memories of my childhood and my parents, so I'd never considered replacing them. I brewed a pot of coffee and reheated the croissant she had bought. The rich smell of the freshly baked pastry filled the room, and Rosie smiled contentedly at the aroma. "It smells wonderful. Just the scent warms my heart." She smiled as she spoke. "Rosie." She introduced herself as she took a small bite of the croissant, savoring it. She wasn't eating because she was hungry, but rather as if she were carefully studying the flavor. Her serious expression made me a little uncomfortable, so I looked away. Even after finishing the last bite, Rosie didn't say anything about the croissant. She took a sip of her coffee and let out a soft sigh. Her earlier words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder. So when you said you'd work for just bread crusts, what did you mean by that? Rosie lowered her eyes as if in deep thought, then slowly began to speak. When I was younger, I lived in Paris. But 8 years ago, I returned home to care for my parents, who had no other relatives. I wanted to keep pursuing my passion, but in the end, I couldn't leave them in their final days. Her quiet words were heavy with the weight of years of sacrifice. As she spoke, I tried to imagine the struggles she had faced. But, my parent passed away last year. It's surprisingly lonely. That's why I'm so exhausted like this. Seeing Rosie laugh like that made my heart take unexpectedly. I had just finished caring for my own parents, and I could understand a little of what she was going through. As I listened to her story, I found myself talking about my own parents and how the bakery was struggling lately. I've been having a really hard time too. Lately, customers have been dropping off, and it's been so difficult. I said this, thinking we could share each other's struggles. We've both been through a lot, haven't we? I thought we might share a wry smile, but instead, Rosie's gaze fixed on a photo in the corner of the room, and her pupils slightly widened. The photo showed my parents, both smiling. It was a picture I took when I was young, back when the two of them ran the bakery together. As I continued speaking, Rosie's expression changed. The warmth in her face faded, and she furrowed her brow, showing a deep sadness, an expression that was hard to describe. Rosie remained silent for a moment before speaking softly. "Thank you so much for keeping this bakery going." She directed words of gratitude toward me. It was a completely unexpected statement, completely out of the blue, not fitting into the flow of the conversation at all. I felt confused, wondering why she was thanking me. But Rosie, with a deep sincerity in her eyes, thanked me again from the bottom of her heart. "Thank you. You've worked so hard," she whispered. In that moment, it felt as though the tight string that had been holding me together snapped, and tears began to flow uncontrollably. The tears wouldn't stop. I didn't know why, but it wasn't sadness, it was happiness. I had been holding myself together, alone, for so long. There had been no one to rely on. I hadn't even had time to grieve the loss of those most dear to me, just fighting to survive. For the first time, it felt like someone, even if it was Rosie, whom I just met, truly understood the softer parts of me that I kept hidden. Thank you," I said, tears still streaming down my face, beginning to feel flustered. I realized just how much loneliness I had been carrying. Rosie's words brought something important back to the surface for me. After that, I opened up about how tough things had been with the bakery. Rosie quietly listened, trying to understand my pain. Once I finished speaking, Rosie fell silent, seeming to think deeply. When I looked at the clock, I realized how much time had passed. "Maybe this is fate," I said, and asked if she would stay the night. Rosie said, "I'd be honored to," and she nodded deeply. That night, we had a little drink and went to bed. I was a bit excited, maybe because it felt so good to finally open up and share my feelings with someone. As I lay in bed, I started remembering the old days. There was always the smell of bread. When I would get up and head to the workshop, there would be Mom and Dad, kneading dough. "Good morning," Mom would say with a smile, though her face was blurry, perhaps because it was such a distant memory. I remember a ladybug on her white apron. In the black and white memory, the red and black spots stood out strangely vividly. I tried to gently catch the bug with my fingers, thinking it wasn't good to have insects in a place where food was made. but she softly grabbed my hand and smiled. "Let's go outside together." She led me outside. She lightly brushed her apron, and the ladybug opened its small wings and flew away. Its flight was clumsy. She gazed peacefully at the path of the ladybug. She seemed to have fallen asleep without realizing it, as memories from the past flooded her mind. When she woke up, something was noticeably different about the house. The smell of bread. She got up from the bed and ran her hand over her head several times. Even though it was still before prep time, the delightful aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the room. Was she still dreaming? No, that wasn't it. Rubbing her eyes instinctively, she hurried to the workshop, eager to find the source of the smell. As she opened the door, an impressive array of bread lined the workbench. Croissants, baguettes, and colorful pastries were beautifully baked, filling the room with a warm, inviting atmosphere, almost like the arrival of spring. Overwhelmed with surprise and admiration, her words caught in her throat as Rosie bowed her head apologetically. "I'm sorry for using the dough and ingredients without asking. This is amazing. Did you do all of this by yourself, Rosie?" She couldn't help but pick up a croissant in front of her. The dough had been prepped the day before, but the shaping must have been done since early morning. Even now, Rosie's hands continued to work without missing a beat, skillfully forming the bread with efficient and swift movements. Rosie smiled as she worked the dough. The frail impression I had of her from the previous day vanished, replaced by youthful energy as Rosie seamlessly transitioned to the baking process. "Actually, I used to be a baker in Paris." "What? Paris? That Paris?" Startled and slightly flustered, something clicked in her mind the moment she heard those words. She remembered that her parents, when they were young, had gone to Paris to train as bakers. Mom rarely met other bakers besides her parents, so the mention of Paris made her wonder. Of course, seeking out the authentic taste of bread must have drawn them there. It made perfect sense. Those who pursue the art of bread making inevitably find their way to Paris. Her parents had met during their training in Paris and later married. I didn't know much about Paris, its location in France, or how long it would take to get there from the U.S. by plane. All she had was this vague image of Paris being glamorous and having a compact city center. So she simply said with a smile, "Maybe you met my parents there." Rosie laughed cheerfully, seeing her smile. "Maybe I did," he replies. A new sense of hope began to grow within me. Even though Rosie was older, it would be a shame for such skill to go unused. She felt a strong urge to work alongside Rosie, to try her best with her. "I can't exactly pay you in bread crusts, but how about living in with us for $100? Rosie grasped her hand firmly. There was a chance that no one would come to the shop. Now that tall condos dominated the area, I might not be able to continue running the bakery my parents had cherished so much. But at least, she thought, she could make the end as joyful as possible. If even a few more people came to the shop and left with a smile, enjoying the delicious bread, that would be enough. Afterward, she taught Rosie how to use the shop's machines. As expected of a former professional baker, Rosie learned quickly. In fact, I had the sense that Rosie was even more skilled with the machines than she was. When she pointed this out, Rosie smiled. "Most of these machines were made back in the day, so I'm familiar with them," and said. A peaceful week had passed. That day, as I casually checked the bakery's website, I couldn't believe my eyes. To my astonishment, there were 59 interview requests flooding in. The simple website I had made myself had a direct messaging feature, and now there were a ton of emails piling up. The site had barely seen any traffic, But suddenly, starting last week, the number of views skyrocketed to unbelievable numbers. I was overwhelmed and confused, wondering what on earth was going on, and soon found myself swamped with calls and emails regarding the interview requests. Rosie, there's a lot of interviews and things to deal with. It's really overwhelming. I struggled to wrap my head around the situation, feeling a wave of confusion wash over me. Rosie, while cleaning up after the shop had closed for the day, spoke up apologetically. Actually, I told an old contact in the media about your bakery. My bakery. They must have thought a bakery I recommend is worth covering, and I kind of let it slip that I'm working here. Word spread in the industry that my bread's making a comeback, and now, well, all these requests came flooding in. I tilted my head, completely baffled. An interview because of Rosie's recommendation. Rosie's bread making a comeback. As I continued listening to her, I learned that Rosie had even participated in an international bread competition. There's a major world competition in France, where bakers showcase their skills, and she was a renowned figure in that circle. I gazed at her with a newfound sense of awe and respect. But then, a question popped into my mind. But why would someone as accomplished as you choose to work at my little shop? Because I could sense your passion for bread. I wanted to rediscover the joy of baking again myself. Rosie smiled warmly as she locked eyes with me. Then, no, I don't think I should keep it a secret any longer. As if deciding there was no point in hiding anything, she murmured, "It's true I returned because I had to care for my parents, but coming to this shop wasn't a coincidence." "What? Are you talking about that day you came to buy a croissant for the first time?" "A few months ago, while going through my parents' belongings, I found a letter from your parents. In that letter, they wrote about how happy they were. Your parents were young, and you were still a little girl, but the three of you looked so joyful in the photos they sent." Her words sent a ripple of surprise and unease through my heart. Rosie reached into a large suitcase she had left sitting nearby and handed me a letter. It was old and faded, but on the back, there was a family photo, taken in front of a bright and new bakery sign that read Printemps. In the photo were my beautiful mother Cyndy and my strong father Arnold. And there I was, flashing a bright smile straight into the camera. It was from back when my mom was still alive, the good old days, when everything was perfect. Good old days she had always spoken of, and the sight of it made my chest tighten. As I continued staring at the photo, Rosie said, "Before I walked into the shop, I had no idea your parents had passed away. It broke my heart. I was so sad. But then I knew, Tiana, I knew I wanted to help you." Rosie told me this, her voice gentle yet sincere. My parents had trained under Rosie at her bakery in Paris. They were young and full of passion, and they had worked hard, contributing greatly to Rosie's business. They had talked about returning home and opening a bakery of their own, but the distance had kept Rosie from seeing them for years. Guided by the address on the letter, Rosie had visited my shop. The products lined up in the store were completely different from the bread Rosie had taught them to make. Of course, they were different. It wasn't my parents who made this place. It was me. But Rosie stared at the few remaining pieces of bread, then pointed to a croissant. "That croissant is still the same. The shape is exactly like the one I taught them." When she was in Paris, Rosie had acted like a surrogate parent to my own. She adored them both, and that's why she's so determined to help you. Rosie's words warmed my heart, filling me with a sense of gratitude. I finally understood why this shop was named Printemps. The name, meaning spring in French, might have been a tribute to Rosie. an expression of my parents' respect and appreciation for her. It filled me with happiness knowing that someone my parents loved so much was now here to support me. After that, the success of the interview was beyond what I had imagined. Due to her age, Rosie let me handle most of the interviews. I would explain the store's concept, introduce our best-selling items, and speak about the most important thing, love. I put my heart into every piece of bread I make. I want everyone who eats it to feel happiness. Once the interviews were broadcasted on television and featured in magazines, the store became so popular that lines stretched out the door. The shop was always full of life, and every day, surrounded by smiling customers. I worked side by side with Rosie making bread. Watching the long lines, I couldn't help but turn to Rosie and say, "We're busy every day, and sales are incredible. Our profits are soaring, and it's all thanks to you, Rosie." Rosie smiled kindly. "Don't misunderstand. It's because of your passion, combined with my experience, that we got here. Neither of us could have made it this far alone." The shop stayed busy from morning to evening. We were so swamped that we hardly had time to take breaks. But seeing our bread selling out one after another, I never felt tired. I was having too much fun. By evening, nearly everything had sold out, and the shop began to calm down. The crowd outside started to thin when Nicola walked in with her father, Huey, by her side. Nicola's eyes widened in surprise as she took in the shop's busy atmosphere. Almost all the bread was gone, and the only line left was for tomorrow's pre-orders. So many customers. Nicola, seemingly in shock, whispered as she stared at the scene, her mouth hanging open. "Welcome, I'm so sorry, but we've nearly sold out." Before Nicola, who was still standing there in disbelief, Huey stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. He turned to me with a serious expression. With a heavy voice, "About that matter we discussed," he said. A wave of anxiety spread through me, and I instinctively glanced at Rosie standing beside me. Were they about to take the land away? Just then, Huey pushed Nicola's head down as if forcing her to apologize, and he started apologizing to me himself. What on earth was happening? I thought, feeling a bit perplexed. Huey then began explaining everything. Apparently, the high-rise apartment project she had been talking about was a lie. It seems she had concocted the story as part of a scheme to harass me and force me to sell the shop. Huey apologized over and over again, but Nicola refused to meet my eyes. I had gone past anger and was just left feeling exasperated. Eventually, even Huey noticed my demeanor and urged me to apologize. Nicola, lifting her head, had a twisted expression on her face. Was it embarrassment? She looked away. Back then, this place was on the brink of going under. So how could you? She would probably never understand. She would never understand the way I wanted to protect this store, the one someone precious left for me. Maybe at that moment, I looked at her with pity in my eyes. When our eyes met, her face contorted even more. What? This popularity is only temporary. People will get bored, and things will go back to how they were before. She screamed, her voice filled with frustration. At that moment, Huey's expression shifted to one of sternness. "Nicola, that's enough. Do you even realize how disrespectful you're being to her?" he scolded. Nicola, looking up at Huey in shock, tears began to fill her eyes. "Dad, He was so angry, it seemed like he was about to raise his hand to her in fury. But before anything could escalate, Rosie stepped forward, rubbing her aching back as she moved between them, and gave Nicole a gentle smile. "Is hurting others for your own desires really what makes you happy?" "What are you talking about?" Of course not. It's just that do you even understand how much effort Tiana has put into keeping this place going? Do you know how many people she's made happy with her work? Have you ever done that for anyone else? She stood there silently for a while, but soon her face hardened, her expression filled with pain as tears rolled down her cheeks. I just couldn't stand seeing Tiana succeed. I never got any recognition. I was always in the shadows. People only saw me as some spoiled rich girl. That's your problem, not hers. If you think stepping on someone else's hard work is going to solve anything, you're dead wrong. Rosie remained unfazed by her tears and fired back. At that moment, Aita turned back to me and, lowering his head slightly, said, "It's my fault for spoiling her. I should have made her struggle sooner. Nicola, I'm cutting ties with you. Leave the house immediately." Nicola, startled by his harsh words, burst into even more tears. She collapsed to her knees. "No, no, no, I won't leave. I don't want to." But Huey, grabbing her arm, dragged her out of the shop as she screamed and fought back. As I watched her being forcibly taken away, I couldn't help but feel relieved. Rosie gently stroked my head. Since I'm a little taller than her, she had to stretch up, straining a bit, but she did her best, reaching up to pat my head with all her strength. "You're amazing, truly amazing. You've worked so hard. Really, you've done such a great job, even with other customers in the shop." Rosie's voice trembled as she said this to me, her eyes filled with tears. I felt embarrassed, and all I could do was look down in silence. A few months passed after that. The bakery, Printemps, had firmly established its place in the community. The bread Rosie and I made was always filled with love, and that warmth seemed to capture people's hearts, making them come back again and again. We even started getting coverage from the media, and customers from out of state began to visit. In the midst of these busy days, working with Rosie to bake every day filled me with a deep sense of satisfaction. And then one day, Huey, now a regular at the bakery, came in once again. He looked a little older than I remembered. As usual, he used the tongs to place a few pastries on his tray, then walked to the register and gave me a small smile. While I was calculating the total, "Tiana, I came here today to say thank you," he said. "I heard Nicola is having a hard time in a new city. I've realized it was my failure as a parent, and I regret it. But through your bakery, I believe she learned some important lessons." I put the bread in a bag and responded vaguely. I couldn't help but think that he truly loved her with all his heart. Despite worrying about his daughter, struggling far away from home, deep down, he sincerely wished for her to become a strong and independent adult. I had no idea how she was doing these days, but I had this feeling that someday, after going through various hardships, Nicola and I would finally understand each other. After all, even though we were now on such bad terms, we used to be childhood friends who played together. Nicola has always been a proud girl, so I'm sure she'll come back having achieved something great, even though my words had no real basis. He nodded deeply. "Thank you. No matter what path she chooses, I want to support her," he said. His expression was that of a parent full of love for their child. I realized I no longer had anyone who treated me with such kindness or strictness. As always, the small shop was full of people smiling as they chose their bread. At that moment, a memory came to me. When I was a child, standing near my mom's feet at the register, watching the customers. That's right. Back when my parents had just started the bakery, it was always this busy, too. I was too young to help, so I would just hide in the corner of the register and watch the shop. Occasionally, the smell of freshly baked bread would fill the shop, and my dad, dressed in his white apron, would rush out with a tray of hot bread. The memories always came to me in black and white, blending with the present in my mind. Tiana, when the register's clear, you need to start preparing the next batch. There's no time to just stand around. Rosie lightly tapped my back with her small hand, and then started arranging the freshly baked bread. With a voice that didn't match her elderly appearance, she called out loudly, "Fresh croissants are ready." And soon enough, she was surrounded by customers eager for the hot croissants. I felt tears welling up. Rosie looked so much like Mom, or maybe Dad. I was so happy, and yet so sad. But as I ran up the next customer, those feelings slowly faded away. The croissants I made, using the techniques Rosie taught me from my parents, remained the bakery's top seller. Each day, the shop was filled with smiles and the smell of warm, freshly baked bread. And despite the busyness, there was always a sense of fulfillment. Living with Rosie has been a truly irreplaceable time for me. "Rosie, looks like the bread's going to turn out just right today," I said with a smile, and Rosie smiled back in response to my words. "Yes, it's important to bake with love. I always put my heart into it. This is something my parents taught me. When you make bread, you must do it with love. And no matter how hard life gets, as long as you don't give up, happiness will surely come." This lesson was passed from Rosie to my parents, and now it's been passed on to me. "Tiana, your waist," Rosie said, directing my attention to my waist. A small ladybug had attached itself to my clothes, and as I noticed it, it spread its wings and flew away. When I was in Paris, I heard a story like this. Ladybugs are a symbol of happiness. If one lands on you, it takes away all your worries or illness when it flies away. So, Tiana, did your worries fly away with it? I looked at Rosie and placed my hand on my chest, smiling. The fear of running the bakery alone after losing my parents, that overwhelming anxiety had disappeared from inside me before I even realized it. But the one who truly took away my worries wasn't that ladybug. It's the person who, I'm sure, will continue to smile beside me from now on.
My name is Layla, and I'm 37 years old, working as a homemaker. I've been married to my husband Jimmy for 13 years now. Currently, we are living together as a family of 4 with our daughter Karen and my mother-in-law. A few years ago, after my father-in-law passed away, we started living with my mother-in-law at her place. Living with mother-in-law in her home was anything but peaceful. Suddenly, after we moved in, she began to harass me. "Is dinner ready?" "Oh, yes. It will be done shortly." "How long are you planning to make everyone wait?" While I was cooking, mother-in-law came into the kitchen and started tasting the food. "Layla, this pot roast has no flavor. It's awful." "Oh, really? I thought I had seasoned it well. How could you taste it and still have it turn out like this? You are really bad at cooking." Jimmy and Karen must feel so pitiful with this food. "I'm sorry. Jimmy must be having a hard time with such a useless wife. Hurry up and set the table." She complained constantly but never helped with preparing dinner. Mother-in-law didn't just push cooking onto me, she left all household chores to me and just lazed around the house during the day. "Dinner's ready, everyone." As the whole family sat down and started eating, Jimmy and Karen praised the pot roast that mother-in-law had earlier criticized, saying, "This pot roast is delicious." "Yeah, Mom, it's tasty." Then mother-in-law said, "Yes, indeed. The seasoning is just right." She was now saying the exact opposite of what she had said before. Despite her harassment and nasty comments to me, she always spoke kindly to Jimmy and Karen, probably not wanting them to dislike her. Layla is really good at cooking. Oh, thank you. In front of Jimmy and Karen, she sometimes praises me. Today, Layla did all the housework, considering my health. She's truly a capable wife. Is that right, Layla? In truth, mother-in-law had just forced household chores onto me. No. As I tried to deny it, mother-in-law kicked my leg under the table where no one else could see. Ah, yes. That's true. Thanks for always being kind to my mom. Jimmy thanked me with a beaming smile. Even though that wasn't the truth. I could never hide my bewilderment at mother-in-law's blatant attitude. Because of this, Jimmy never noticed that I was being harassed, and he even thought that mother-in-law and I got along well. Jimmy really cared for mother-in-law, and when father-in-law passed away, he was more concerned for her than anyone else. I couldn't bring myself to say anything bad about mother-in-law to such a loving Jimmy and had never been able to talk to him about it. Karen being very fond of mother-in-law was another reason why I couldn't consult anyone. When it was decided that we'd live together with my in-laws, Karen said, "Yay! I get to live with Grandma now," and was delighted. Mother-in-law adored Karen, and they always played together, took baths together, they were very close. Taking advantage of that, mother-in-law's harassment towards me escalated. When I came back from shopping, the room was all messed up. "Hey! Mother-in-law, what happened? Why is everything so scattered?" I asked, surprised, and mother-in-law answered with a smirk. I couldn't find something, and before I knew it, it had become a mess. The house wouldn't be turned upside down just from looking for something. Mother-in-law surely did it to harass me. Sorry. I'm going to dinner with friends now. Cleanup's on you. As expected, I ended up cleaning, and mother-in-law fled the house. That day, cleaning took all day, and I couldn't do any other chores. Then mother-in-law came back home and said, "Laundry, dishes, cleaning, none of it's done? What on earth were you doing?" Holding back my anger at mother-in-law's scheme, I quietly continued with the housework. Hurry up, or everyone will come home. If Jimmy realizes what an incapable wife you are, he'll surely divorce you. Mother-in-law never helped with the chores and constantly nagged and rushed me. I was getting more and more frantic as dinner was nowhere near ready. In the end, dinner was late. What? Dinner's not ready yet? I'm sorry. It'll be ready soon. Just wait a bit longer. Jimmy asked, looking concerned. Are you feeling ill? No, it's not that, but... I thought about explaining why dinner was late, but when I glanced at mother-in-law, she was glaring as if to say, "Don't you dare. Today has been a bit hectic." Oh, I see. I'm sorry. No, it's totally fine. Mother-in-law seemed to be trying to portray me as an incapable wife who's hindered by her, hoping Jimmy would get fed up and divorce me. But Jimmy is so kind that instead of blaming me, he was even worried about me. Mother-in-law didn't find this amusing, and her daily harassment towards me only escalated. Lately, it's not just about the harassment towards me, she started interfering with Karen's affairs. You two seem to be trying to get Karen into a private middle school. Yes, we are. Is there a problem with that? It's cruel to make her study late every night for exams. Stop it right now. Well, we're not going to stop just because you said so. Karen herself has expressed a desire to go to a private middle school. We are not forcing her to study and go against her will. Kids should just play and have fun. There's no need to force them to study now. But working hard now will open up more options for her future, and Karen wants this. You're not doing it for Karen, you're forcing it on her, aren't you? That's not true. Lately, as Karen has been studying at night and attending tutoring, our time together has decreased, and mother-in-law seemed displeased. Just give up on the middle school exams, it's a waste of time. I couldn't hold back my anger at this comment. I was furious at mother-in-law for disrespecting Karen's feelings and only saying selfish things. Isn't it normal to support Karen when she wants to do this? What? How dare you talk back? Mother-in-law was quite surprised as I had never talked back before. Karen's exams have nothing to do with you, mother-in-law. What do you mean, nothing to do? I'm her grandmother. Feeling like arguing would get us nowhere, I left saying, "Enough of this. I'm going to pick up Karen." Mother-in-law continued to harass me in front of Jimmy and Karen, seemingly unable to let go of me talking back. Today's dinner looks plain? Is this all we have? I guess she must have been furious with me. You can't even think about feeding a growing child? I'm sorry. Finally, Jimmy couldn't just listen in silence and snapped at mother-in-law. Come on, Mom. Don't complain about the meal that Layla made. His anger ignited. Jimmy had mother-in-law flustered. She quickly backpedaled. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not what I meant to say. Not wanting to start another fight, I brushed it off with, "It's fine." After dinner, while I was washing dishes, mother-in-law came over and muttered, "Remember this," and went back to her room. From then on, every day was filled with fear, wondering what she might do next. Then, one day. It was the day of Karen's acceptance announcement. We headed to the venue, all nerves. When we checked the bulletin board, Karen's number was clearly written there. You did it, Karen. Awesome. You got accepted. Yay. We were all overjoyed. Karen had been studying without a break for months. Thanks to her efforts, she had passed the middle school exams. We have to celebrate today. Yes. Karen, what would you like to eat? Steak. Steak was Karen's absolute favorite. Should we order delivery today? Hooray! On my way home, I called the steakhouse and ordered a luxury steak for delivery. We also decided to buy a cake, so I made a small detour on my way home, asking my mother-in-law to receive the steak delivery at the house. When I called mother-in-law, she said, "Understood. I'll take care of it." Because of various detours, we were completely past lunchtime by the time we got home. I'm starving. I want to eat the steak now. You're right, we're late. The steak should be here, so let's eat plenty. Okay. When we arrived home, we just ran into mother-in-law's friends as they were leaving. They all said in unison, "Thanks for the feast," and left, making me wonder what was going on. I had a bad feeling and rushed into the house. The delivered steak was all messed up on the table. Mother-in-law, did you eat this steak? Oh, if it's the delivery steak, I enjoyed it with my friends at a luncheon. You'll pay for it later. What are you doing? When I yelled at mother-in-law, she replied, You were probably planning to order delivery and slack off from housework. I won't allow that. This was to celebrate Karen's success. Success celebration? What success? I had told mother-in-law in advance that today was Karen's exam acceptance announcement. She seemed to have forgotten because she hadn't listened to me. Karen and Jimmy arrived late. Karen had heard our conversation in the corridor and was crying. Grandma's so mean. Karen had been excited to report to Grandma quickly, but to think that she didn't even remember the acceptance announcement day. I thought it was understandable for Karen to cry. Mom, today was Karen's middle school acceptance announcement. How could you forget such an important day? That's awful. Mother-in-law seemed unable to hide her agitation. What, today? Layla, why didn't you tell me earlier? I did tell you. I was too stunned to even feel angry. Karen worked hard and got accepted, so we were going to celebrate by eating her favorite steak. To think you'd eat it with your friends. I can't believe it. No, it wasn't like that. I really didn't know. You didn't know? I called you about the delivery, didn't I? That's... Mom, did you eat it on purpose? On purpose, you say. Mother-in-law's face turned paler and paler, and she began to sweat. She was desperately trying to think of an excuse, but seemed to have no words to say. I've suspected this for a while, but you really are harassing Layla, aren't you? It seems Jimmy had a vague idea of what was going on. But since I didn't talk to him about it, he just watched the situation. Suddenly mother-in-law approached Karen and said, I'm sorry. Let's all go to the steakhouse. I'll pay. Karen responded. I hate Grandma. She pushed mother-in-law away and ran to her room. The shock of being hated by her beloved granddaughter seemed to be tremendous, and mother-in-law froze after falling on her bottom. After that, I told Jimmy everything about how mother-in-law had been harassing me. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I couldn't say anything when I thought about you and Karen. I'm sorry for forcing you all this time. You don't have to endure it anymore. Jimmy suggested that we move to make sure I wouldn't be harassed anymore. Since Karen also said she didn't want to live with mother-in-law anymore, we were able to leave the house without worry. Thank you. On moving day, while I was packing, mother-in-law came into the room. Are you really leaving the house? Mother-in-law's face looked like she was about to cry. Yes. You must be glad to be away from me, whom you hate. I don't exactly hate you. Can you please leave? You're in the way of my packing. As I tried to drive mother-in-law out of the room, she suddenly began to plead. Please don't leave. I'll apologize for everything. Please. I can't bear to be apart from Karen. Karen also says she doesn't want to live with you. No matter how much I explained, mother-in-law wouldn't let go, clinging and crying. So I made a proposal. Actually, we're moving to my parents' house. If you really can't bear to be apart from Karen, will you come with us? My father is very stern, with a scary face. I knew mother-in-law knew that, so I said it a bit maliciously, thinking she would never agree, but surprisingly. I understand. That's fine with me. I was stunned that she agreed. It seems mother-in-law wanted to be with Karen that badly. Since she wouldn't harass me in front of my parents, and if she did, I could report it to my father, I agreed to live together. Jimmy said, Sorry, if something happens with my mom coming along, feel free to kick her out. So we all moved to my parents' house, and the cohabitation began. My father seemed dissatisfied with mother-in-law came with us. Of course, he knew how mother-in-law had harassed me and ruined Karen's celebration. He didn't blame her directly, but his silent pressure kept mother-in-law shrinking. She spoke less, seemed downcast. Whenever my mother and I asked for help with housework, she readily complied and worked hard. I couldn't help but laugh at her changed appearance. Life went on without any incidents for a while, but finally, mother-in-law reached her limit and yelled, I'm sick of this house. My father is intimidating, and Karen still can't get through to him. I think Jimmy's attitude toward mother-in-law has become colder because he couldn't endure various things anymore. Karen, let's go home together. Mother-in-law tried to forcibly pull a resistant Karen and leave the house. Mother-in-law, stop it. Can't you see Karen doesn't want to go? It's better to be with me than in this house. At that moment, my father arrived. What are you doing? Knock it off. Frightened by my father's forceful yell, mother-in-law froze in fear. I allowed you to live with us because you said you didn't want to be apart from your granddaughter. But if you try to take Karen against her will, I'll call the police for kidnapping. I didn't mean to that way. Hearing my father's shout, Jimmy also rushed over. Mom, what are you doing? Just leave us. We can't be bothered by you anymore. I'm cutting ties completely. No way. Then Karen shook off mother-in-law's hand and screamed, Get out! Even mother-in-law seemed shocked by this, dropping her shoulders and leaving the house in tears. Now she's back at her house, living a lonely life. Afterwards, mother-in-law became reclusive, and it seems that even neighbors and friends have started keeping their distance. On the other hand, our family is living peacefully every day. Karen is studying hard at a private school every day, and Jimmy has become very friendly with my parents, especially my father, with whom he drinks every day. I wish I had talked to Jimmy earlier and moved to my parents' house.